Story 1. The Whispering Tents of Alder Creek. The snowfall that never stopped. The storm had moved in with the relentlessness of a predator, trapping the Donner family at Alder Creek. The snow wasn't soft and beautiful as children back east remembered. Here in the Sierra Nevada, it fell heavy, wet, suffocating, burying wagons, erasing paths, and swallowing any hope of movement. George Donner's hands trembled as he tried to mend a broken wagon tongue by firelight, though everyone knew the wagon would never roll again. The blizzard howled through the pine trees like some ancient animal stalking them, and each morning the children awoke to another foot of snow pressing against the tents, as though the mountain itself wanted to smother them. Inside one of the makeshift shelters, Mary was awakened by a sound she couldn't escape. It wasn't the wind, not exactly. It was softer. Breathing? She pressed her ear against the frozen canvas tent wall, trembling as she heard what seemed like whispers. Many voices, hissing together just beyond the fabric, as if the woods themselves were conspiring. When she yanked the flap back, snowflakes lashed her raw face. But the whispers stopped instantly, leaving only the roar of the storm. Her father scolded her, "Close it! You'll let the cold in." Mary lay back on the floor, teeth chattering, but sleep never came. In the faint glow of dying embers, she thought she saw a shadow at the edge of the shelter. Someone crouched and listening. When she rubbed her eyes, the corner was empty. Hunger's bite. The snow never melted. Days blurred into nights without end. Rations were measured down to crumbs. A bite of oxhide boiled until it tasted of leather and smoke. A small handful of mold-dusted flour. Hunger gnawed through the group like a disease, dragging tempers low and spirits lower. Young Isaac Donner was too weak to rise one morning. His lips cracked, his voice barely stronger than a whisper. "Mama, they're calling outside." His mother swallowed her dread. "No one is out there, Isaac. Everyone is sleeping." But that evening, as the wind died suddenly, a silence so immense it felt ominous, others admitted hearing it too, whispering. Not words exactly, but a scratching murmur, as though dozens of voices pressed around their shelters waiting to be acknowledged. Some thought it was simply pine boughs shifting under ice. Others prayed it was nothing. That night, George Donner himself rose to investigate, axe in hand. His lantern threw a weak glow over collapsing snowdrifts. The camp was still, except for the shape between the trees. A tall silhouette, impossibly thin, standing motionless against the moonlit snow. George blinked, and when his flame sputtered, the figure was gone. The next morning, heavy boot prints, not theirs, were found leading toward the forest and then stopping mid-step, vanishing without trail. The pact of silence. By January, the scream no longer surprised them. Each hut, each tent, each dugout cradled the sound of human despair on long nights. But this scream was different, sharper. The Breens, huddled in their cramped cabin, swore they heard hands scratching desperately against their wooden walls as if trying to dig inside. Patrick Breen opened the door, torch shaking, but only an expanse of white waited outside. Yet in the distance, faint hollows marked the snow, kneeling impressions as if someone had crawled around their home, circling it. In Alder Creek, the Donners sat grim. Talk of rescue fizzled into resignation. Children grew pale and silent, gaunt cheeks darkening with frostbite. Sarah Murphy whispered a suggestion so horrifying that everyone recoiled. They would survive only if they considered consuming. Before an answer could form, old Mrs. Keseberg hissed, "The voices asked for it already, haven't they?" Mothers clutched their children tighter. The room's silence thickened, crushed under shame, yet also under a dark recognition. That very night, the voices came strongest, chanting clearer now, overlapping murmurs urging them to eat, survive, eat. Crouched inside, no one dared admit hearing the same chorus. When dawn arrived, Isaac Donner was no longer among the living. Footsteps in the white. Though Isaac's death was cloaked in silence, the ground bore witness to secrets. Tracks surrounded the camp again, single-file footprints impossibly large, wider than any man's, circling in maddening loops. Mary woke to the sound of crunching snow directly above her canvas. It paced slowly back and forth, heavy, deliberate. When she dared peek outside, no one was there, though the steps retreated toward the timberline. She swore the snow sank under pressure, as though from legs longer than her father's height. At night, flames flickered with odd vibrations. Shadows did not match the flicker of fire, but jittered, lagging slightly behind. Dark silhouettes moving when no one else stirred. Then hunger broke them. Shackled by desperation, one took the knife. When George attempted to stop it, he froze, because standing among them, no taller than the rafters yet, with a grin wide as split skin, a figure only Mary seemed to see leaned close and whispered, "Now you understand," she screamed. But the figure dissolved into smoke before anyone else saw. By morning, meat was roasting, though no one admitted its source. The wrong rescue. The rescue teams came too late or too strangely. In mid-February, figures appeared through the snow, cloaked and steady against the drifts. "We've come for you," they called, voices strong. Relief fluttered, though weakly. Some stumbled out, clutching thin strips of hide. Mary blinked in confusion. The rescuers wore no snowshoes, bore no frostbite, and their eyes seemed too dark. She followed them, half-conscious, toward the trees. But once they passed the first pines, the rescuers dissolved into the storm, leaving her alone in the blur of white. In panic, she staggered back, snow swallowing her knees, fear clawing her lungs. By the time true rescuers arrived days later, the forlorn hope survivors leading the way, half the party lay dead, while the others sat in stunned silence, unwilling to speak of the whispers, the circling footprints, or the visitors who had come first. When Mary was lifted onto a sled, she stared past the rescuers' shoulders. At the timberline, a tall silhouette lingered, still as stone. For a fraction of a heartbeat, she thought it smiled, with Isaac's lips stretched impossibly wide. She shut her eyes tight, clutching the rescuer's coat, knowing it would never really leave her. Story 2. The Frozen Eyes of Truckee Lake. The black water beneath the ice. By December of 1846, the lake where the emigrants camped was no longer a place of respite. Its surface stretched out like a dead sheet of grey glass, frozen thick, covered in dirty snow. The trapped wagons sat hunched around the shoreline, canvas shredded, families curled near embers. The settlers called it simply Truckee Lake, though later history would rename it Donner Lake. Eddie Breen swore the ice was shifting. At night, when the temperature plummeted, he heard cracks echo across the white sheet like gunshots. But it wasn't the cracks alone that made him swear something alive festered below. "It moves when I stand close," he whispered to his mother. "Something's watching." She scolded him for nonsense, but she caught herself walking further around the frozen patches. The man hacked into the surface to melt drinking water. Once, when William Eddy lowered a bucket into the hole, a slick patch of black water reflected not his face, but an elongated skull behind him, jaw unhinged, eye sockets empty. He stumbled back, breath fogging, and told no one. Not in that starving camp, where illusions and whispers already tore holes in sanity. That very night, campers on the far bank burst awake at the sound of splashing. They raced across the snowdrift, expecting someone to have fallen through. Yet when lanterns struck the ice, the hole gaped wide, but no body was found. Something had climbed out, not in. Snow sealed the cabins like stone tombs. Food vanished until scraping marrow from bones became an evening ritual. They boiled boots, shoes, even thin leather strips torn from wagon harnesses to trick the stomach. Still, the sense of famine only deepened. In their frost-bitten silence, the families avoided speaking aloud of the dead. But at Truckee, bodies lay under tarps, stiffened by cold. Breath fog hung thick in the air, and then people began to disappear. "Wolf dragged it away," Patrick Breen muttered one morning, when Donna's team found that a corpse laid outside the cabin was gone. But the tracks in the snow were too strange, drag marks vanishing midway across the lake, no paw prints beside them. At night, Children swore they saw pale faces pressed against cabin shutters. Wide, empty eyes peering in. "The ones from the water," young Virginia Reed called them. Elders silenced her quickly, but the wound festered. People no longer trusted their own families, terrified that others had crossed that unspeakable boundary of survival. Shadows hovered at the corners of sight. Whispers leaked through cracks in the walls. One mother swore she heard her dead child crying outside in the storm, over and over until dawn. When she finally yanked open the cabin door, nothing waited outside. Nothing except a single line of strange tracks leading to the lake's dark expanse. The man who stayed too long by the fire, Leroy, one of the older boys forced daily to collect pine wood, believed in keeping the fire alive no matter what. Fire repelled the shadows, he claimed. But on a January night, when blizzard winds screamed, he lingered too long staring into the embers. Others watched his head tilt slowly, mouth slackening, as if he were listening. The crackling of logs became words, whispering voices weaving promises of warmth, of escape, of green fields beyond the pass. His pupils widened, and sweat dotted his frost-burnt brow, though the cold cut to the bone. "Leroy?" someone asked cautiously. Without responding, the boy stood, stepped outside barefoot and trudged onto the frozen sheet of the lake. People shouted, scrambling after him. Lanterns lit his tracks, each print filling instantly with black water seeping upward. By the time his father caught him, Leroy was standing in the middle of the lake, eyes vacant, murmuring, "They told me to come." When they grabbed his arms, the ice beneath him cracked open like a maw. A hand, slender, skeletal, dripping with frost, shot upward from the water and nearly grasped his leg. With tremendous effort they pulled him back, leaving the fissure gaping behind. Leroy lived, but he never again spoke, only rocking before the fire, whispering wordless tones in sync with the hiss of burning wood. The rescue that smelled of smoke. By February, the faint promise of rescue fluttered into the half-dead camp. They heard voices calling from the tree line, "We're here!" Shapes appeared through the white shroud, offering food, blankets, salvation. Women wept openly, but there was something wrong. One of the rescuers, face hidden under a hood, handed out food that tasted faintly burnt, as if smoke had seeped into every crumb. Another wore clothes strangely damp to the touch, dripping despite the deep freeze. And each set of eyes, when flickers of firelight revealed them, were glassy and blackened like scorched wood. Pat Breen pulled Mary aside. "Don't eat it," he whispered sharply. "This isn't rescue." Confusion swept the starving group. Some devoured, others refused. That night the camp echoed with screams. Those who had shared food claimed their bellies twisted, as if filled with coals. And yet at dawn the so-called rescuers were gone without tracks in the snow, as though the storm had simply dissolved them. When the real relief party arrived days later, they found the cabin stinking of burned meat. Some were still alive, barely breathing. The others were found with blackened mouths and distant grins frozen on their faces. The eyes that never closed. At last, after months, the rescue expedition succeeded in pulling survivors back through the pass, away from that lake and its cursed silence. Many never made it. For those dragged out alive, memory itself became the monster. Mary Graves was among them. She lived, but sleep never healed her. Each night she would blink awake in her new warm bed thousands of miles from the Sierra, hearing still the creaking of ice splitting, still seeing pale faces pressed against wood slats. She was convinced they followed. At times in lamplight, she swore she saw water dripping across the floorboards, though the carpet stayed dry. And one night, years later, her husband found her standing before the window, smiling faintly at the moonlit yard outside. He asked, "What are you looking at?" Mary exhaled, voice distant, at the faces. They never closed their eyes. When he turned to look, only blackness met his gaze. But Mary screamed, clawing at her own eyelids, muttering about how the watchers had never once blinked. The Donner tragedy scarred history, but not every detail was written down. For those who slept by Truckee Lake, horror was not just starvation, But what stirred beneath the ice, what whispered in the cabins, and what followed them long after escape. Story 3. The Cabin of Hollow Voices. The Walls That Breathed. By mid-December 1846, the cabin walls at Truckee Lake were more prison than shelter. Built crudely from pine logs stuffed with moss and snow, their only purpose was to hold back the storm. But some of the trapped emigrants swore the walls weren't keeping things out, they were keeping something in. James Eddy, feverish and skeletal, lay staring at the logs one night. In the flickering firelight, he swore he saw the wood swell slightly, pressing outward as if invisible lungs expanded behind them. He tried to dismiss it as hunger's trick. Yet the sound came next, a faint groaning, low and guttural like wood grinding against bone. When he whispered of it to others, Patrick Breen snapped, "Better your ears trick you than hear nothing at all." Silence is worse, but silence never lasted. At random hours, someone would hear tapping on the timbers, 3 knocks in a row, followed by a wet sigh. Men hammered crossbeams tighter. Women stacked snow against the structure. The harder they braced the walls, the more violently the wood hissed. On December 28th, a child screamed in the night. She claimed a thin hand had reached through the log wall itself, scratching her shoulder before retreating back into the timber. The cut was shallow, but the blood was real. By sunrise, they all knew the walls weren't just breathing. They were hungry. The shadow by the hearths once offered warmth, comfort. In the Donner cabins, fires barely licked the logs, sputtering against the wind. But one evening, 19-year-old Mary Graves saw someone crouched by the flames who should not have been there. She recognized every face in that cramped room, every gaunt survivor clustered like ghosts. But when her gaze flicked back to the fire, a new shape crouched, long arms hugging knees, head cocked at an unnatural slant. Its skin was darker than soot, but its eyes gleamed wet as if freshly wept. "Do you see it?" she whispered urgently. Her brother shook his head, confused. But Mary screamed, when the thing widened its jaw in a grin that nearly split its face. The moment her cry split the air, the creature dissolved in a shower of ash, collapsing directly into the fire pit. Sparks burst, and for hours afterward smoke filled the cabin without a clear source, choking lungs, stinging eyes. No one dared sleep. The ashes hissed repeatedly that night, whispering hungry, in a language all of them swore they understood but pretended not to. When morning came, they found scorch marks burned into the cabin floors, shaped unmistakably like handprints, all reaching inward. The storm that carried voices. The windstorm of January 1847 was the deadliest yet. Snow pounded the cabins so thick that exits were nearly smothered shut. People shoveled frantically to keep air holes open. During that storm, the voices began. Not merely whispers outside, but full conversations. Mothers swore they heard their dead children calling for them on the other side of the walls. Men claimed they heard cattle lowing, oxen trudging as if salvation had returned. The starving stumbled to the door, desperate for it all to be true. George Foster, hollow-eyed and gaunt, swore by the Lord above he heard someone calling his name from out on the frozen lake. Despite his wife's begging, he forced the flap open and walked into the white roar of nothing. Within minutes, the tracks vanished under snow. His wife screamed until her voice was lost. He was never seen again, not by the living. After that night, others reported hearing George's voice mingled with the storm, always groaning, always pleading, "Come outside. Join me, it's better out here." It became the test of sanity. Who could stand hearing familiar voices urge them into the endless waste, and who would resist? But some admitted secretly to hearing not strangers, not family, but their own voices calling from the dark. The candle at the window. February brought an uneasy quiet. Snow still ruled, but storms lulled occasionally into silence too heavy to bear. One such night, Elizabeth Graves lit a candle in the corner. Its glow fought shadows away for a time, but then she saw another candle outside, identical, flickering faintly beyond the frost-glazed window. She rushed to point it out, but when the others joined her, they saw nothing. Laughter broke nervously. Starvation visions, they called it, returning to their blankets. Elizabeth refused to let it go. She sat vigil at the glass, clutching her thin shawl. Again the light appeared, closer now, swaying. Finally she ripped the door open and followed it into the yard. The snow crunched, the wind hushed. The candlelight hovered ahead of her, weaving between trees. But when she stumbled too far, the flame went out instantly. She realized with dread it hadn't been burning wax after all. It had been two pale eyes staring back at her. Screaming, she staggered toward camp. By the time she returned, something unseen had followed. That night, they all heard shifting footsteps inside the cabin, though no one moved. Objects fell. Blankets were tugged, and the candle flame in their own room sputtered without breeze, shrinking nearly to nothing. What the rescuers found. The first rescue party slashed their way into the snowy basin in mid-February. Exhausted but determined, they reached the first cabin. The rescuers gagged upon opening the door, not merely from the stench of human waste and decay, but something else, rot, mold, smoke baked deep into the logs, as though the wood itself had been poisoning the air. Inside, survivors huddled, pupils wide, gaunt bodies trembling. They spoke, but their voices rasped strangely, as though echoing from far away. When asked their names, some struggled, forgetting or answering with the names of the dead. And from the corner, faint scratching continued behind the walls, though no animals were near. The rescuers ripped apart planks, searching for the source. What they found sickened them. Grooves cut on the inside of the logs, jagged claw marks etched desperately in circles, as if something had lived, or still lives, inside the timber. When they attempted to pull survivors from the room, several screamed in panic that the walls would not forgive them for leaving. It took brute force to drag them into daylight. As the sleds pulled away, one rescuer glanced back. From the window, gaunt silhouettes pressed against the glass. All turned their heads in absolute unison, without blinking, following him with hollow stares until the camp disappeared in snow. For years afterward, whispers said the wood beams salvaged from those cabins groaned when burned in hearth fires across California homes, sighing as though they remembered the voices trapped within. Story 4. The Watchers in the Pass. The Silent Path. In late November of 1846, before the storm sealed them in for good, the snow in the Sierra Nevada already whispered warning. The wagons had slowed to a crawl, oxen freezing where they stood, and men broke trail chest-deep through drifts. The towering peaks loomed like jagged teeth overhead, biting their path shut. James Reed, cast out of the group earlier for killing a man, had already fled eastward. Those who remained trudged through Hastings Cutoff, exhausted, ribs visible, frostbite eating their toes. But for those trapped near the summit pass, salvation disappeared not with snow but with silence. Normally the woods shared sounds, the crack of trees, the chirp of winds, even wolves howling from afar. But one morning there was nothing. No footsteps echoed, no wood snapped under weight. Even the children's sobs came muffled, swallowed by the air. That night they discovered why. Mary Donna swore she saw figures outlined along the ridgeline, dozens of them, unmoving, blacker than the sky. At first she thought it was the pine trunks, but then they tilted their heads, every one of them, in the same sharp motion. When she gasped, they were gone, yet all through the night the silence deepened, pressing down with crushing weight. In that silence, men claimed to hear their own heartbeats pounding like drums, and just between each thud a different rhythm ticked, as if someone else's pulse was keeping time nearby. They had entered a pass where the snow was not only their enemy, something was watching. The last tracks of Franklin Graves, January 1847. Desperation had gnawed through every cabin. Franklin Graves, 60 years old, had urged his daughters and the others of the infamous Forlorn Hope escape party to follow him west through towering snow toward Sacramento settlements. He'd sworn he could guide them, but the Sierra kept its cruelty. The volunteers marched for days without end, starving, shoes dissolving into strips of rawhide. When snow blinded them, Franklin would raise his staff and shout back that the path still existed, though none could see it. On the fourth day, as the moon glowed weak behind clouds, Franklin's voice faltered. He called back, "Keep moving. Keep and then silence. When the group reached the slope ahead, Franklin's tracks ended. Not covered, not lost to snow, simply ended. The final footprints pressed clearly, deeply into the powder, as if he had stepped down firmly. But after that, nothing. No collapse, no trail, no struggle. Just absence behind them. The others whispered in terror. He didn't fall, he was taken. Through the swirling flakes, figures returned, dark and tall amid the trees. Their outlines swayed unnaturally, like branches twisting though no wind touched them. The volunteers panicked, stumbling forward, clutching at each other. That night, huddled beneath tattered blankets, they heard Franklin's voice whisper through the storm, "Follow me, please, don't stay here." His daughters wept in silence, knowing the impossible truth. He no longer existed where men could tree. The cabin of Louis Keseberg. By February, cabins near Truckee Lake had rotted into hovels of despair. Among them, the name whispered most in later testimonies was that of Louis Keseberg. The man had arrived pious enough, but starvation stripped civility quickly. Other families claimed he had taken to muttering when alone, answering invisible questions in freezing air. His eyes darted constantly to the shadows, as though expecting someone at his shoulder. When a boy crept near Keseberg's hut to fetch firewood, he swore he heard laughter inside, but not the laughter of a single man. It was layered, low voices overlapping one another, echoing from deep in the cabin's belly. Scavengers found strange things near Keseberg's door, shapes carved crudely into bark, twisted runes resembling human bodies left headless. No one wanted to accuse him directly, though they all whispered of what food he might have been eating. One night during a lull in the storm, travelers nearby sat rigid as the cabin door opened wide without sound. A faint yellow glow spilled from within, yet no fire burned there. Instead, they saw Keseberg crouched before something darker than the cabin's shadows, speaking in stuttering sobs. When others tried to confront him the next day, he denied it. His teeth, however, bore stains not from bark or bone, but from something far nearer. After the tragedy ended months later, rescuers claimed Keseberg was one of the men left alive, sitting silently in that cabin among corpses. To his dying day, he insisted, "They promised me life, if I obeyed." The girl in the snow among the children, Virginia Reed, endured horrors enough to warp a lifetime. She was just 13 when the group was snowed in. Survival forced silence upon her lips. But the image that haunted her began one February night when she woke to find a figure kneeling in snow outside the cabin flap. At first, she thought it was her friend, another child gazing up at her. The figure's hair was thick with frost, its cheeks hollowed, its lips moving soundlessly. When Virginia whispered its name, the girl raised one arm, then slowly lifted her other, exposing no hands, only sharpened black stumps like charred wood. Virginia screamed, rousing the quarters. Men stomped into the night bearing torches. The strange visitor was gone, but in the snow just outside the flap lay footprints unlike human ones, elongated with marks dragging behind them, as if claws had scraped the surface. For weeks after, the survivor could not rest. She heard that soft knocking at intervals, like those black stumps still tapping at the cabin canvas. When the rescue party finally brought her to safety months later, neighbors swore Virginia still woke screaming of a girl kneeling, hands missing, eyes filled with white light. The shadow that stayed, the Forlorn Hope Party and the eventual rescue efforts did manage to save dozens by spring, yet the Sierra kept its secrets buried with those who did not emerge. When rescuers first entered the pass, they claimed a collective dread pressed on them. Some men refused to continue deeper, insisting the air filled with groaning like submerged voices beneath a lake. At Truckee Lake, the stench of smoke, rot, and blood made breathing nearly unbearable. And though corpses lay where snow half covered them, many reported an extra figure, the shape of a man tall, watching them from the edge of the timber. Tools passed directly through the spot where they thought he stood, proving it was nothing but shadow. But when they returned to their own campfires at night, the same elongated silhouette always danced on the ridge closer each evening. Even after escape, several rescuers whispered of dreams where forests of endless snow stretched on forever, each dream punctured by the sound of bones cracking underfoot, and the same tall watchman moving along the ridges. The Donner Party's name carried through history as famine, tragedy, and desperate hunger. But for the few who had breathed the mountain's silence, it also brought memory of the watchers who did not belong to the world of the living. Some say the shadow waits still in the pass every winter. Those who camp too long beneath those peaks sometimes wake to see a figure tilt its head, still as stone until morning swallows it in fog. Story 5. The Snow-Covered Graves. The Meadow That Vanished. When the Donner Party first reached the Sierra's frozen meadow in October 1846, there was a brief, flickering hope. The land opened up between jagged trees, and the broad clearing promised grass for cattle. Exhausted children tumbled from wagons, boots sinking into slush, clutching each other with relief. But by nightfall, blizzards swept the mountains, burying that meadow beneath an ocean of snow. Wagons disappeared like toys swallowed whole, only the tips of canvas roofs peeking up like tombstones. Jacob Donner spent hours ramming a shovel through the hard-packed surface, his breath heaving, until his wife begged him to stop. The meadow was gone, and each scrape of the shovel sounded not on snow, but something else when he thrust deeper. Wood clunked hollowly beneath him. "That should not be there," he whispered, voice shaking. Others crowded near. They listened, and beneath the snow, thick as any grave, there came the muffled echoes of knocking. No one returned there after night fell. Yet from the clearing where the meadow had been, came the faintest chorus of voices groaning in unison, "Stay with us." The Body That Wouldn't Freeze. By December, death was inevitable. Exhaustion, frostbite, starvation, they each claimed their payment. Small bodies lay wrapped beneath shredded blankets, placed gently in frozen drifts so others could carry on. But one body, the settlers whispered about in sick terror. A young boy of the Murphy family had perished quietly one night. His mother kissed his forehead while sobbing, then covered him carefully in snow outside their cabin. The next morning, others preparing wood gasped in horror. The boy's body rested upright, eyes wide, skin faintly flushed as if warm. "We must rebury him deeper," they whispered fearfully. But again, each time they buried him, the body returned, closer to the cabin flap, snow clinging in uneven patches. On the third night, someone swore he had seen the figure moving, gentle, crooked steps pressing down in the frost. The mother begged them to stop speaking lies, until she too saw her child's face in the firelight, pressed against the thin fabric of the tent wall. Lips blue but jaw spreading into a faint, awful grin. None dared open the flap. The tracks outside multiplied. The feast that ate back. In February, with starvation reducing the camp to husks of themselves, necessity overpowered morality. Several survivors made the unholy choice: they would consume the dead. Flesh roasted bitterly on sharpened sticks, carrying thick smoke that clung to the nostrils and wouldn't fade. Some wept while eating, some cursed, some prayed louder than the snowstorm could swallow. But that night those who partook became restless. They clawed blankets away. They hissed in their sleep. And they dreamed of being back at that meadow from October. Except the snow was gone, replaced with a pit full of writhing, coal-black figures. Each figure carried the faces of those devoured. Mary Murphy screamed bloody into the night, choking on her own bite, claiming she felt teeth still chewing inside her stomach. Others clawed their bellies raw, insisting something inside them was still alive. The feast did sustain them, but soon, survivors whispered that it was not hunger they had satisfied, but another appetite entirely. Something inhuman had wanted them to eat, and now it was no longer a question of survival. It was obedience. The blizzard of Ice March arrived, and the snow refused to die. One storm lashed harder than the months before, ripping canvas, swallowing walls. Amid that storm, the air itself became spectacle. Virginia Reed peered upward into the white chaos, and what she saw was not snowflakes but countless eyes swirling in the gale. Each fleck of ice looked alive, glassy and staring. Children wailed in hysterics. "They're looking! They're looking at us!" Even strong men crumbled under its weight, covering their faces, refusing to meet the air. Patrick Breen's journal would later contain one odd passage no historian explained. "This night the sky it gazes. This night we are known." The storm battered all night. Those who had closed their eyes slept, but the ones who stayed awake swore the gusts carried names. Each survivor's own whispered back to them in icy stutters. When they staggered out in daylight, snowdrifts had piled taller than cabins, hiding entire wagons, and stamped into each drift. Shapes resembling sockets and mouths, not random collapse, not weather. Faces carved directly into the snowbanks, hundreds of them wide and gaping, frozen in screams, still watching. The empty graves. At last, the rescue parties cut into that hollowed camp. They carried sleds, blankets, food. They spoke with urgency, urging half-dead skeletons to crawl into daylight. But even hardened rescuers knew something was dreadfully wrong. Cabins reeked of smoke, rot, iron. Silence hung heavy. And when they dug into the snowbanks to uncover those placed respectfully under white cover, they recoiled. Because the graves were empty. Children buried weeks ago, men laid gently to rest. All gone. The snow revealed hollows like great mouths, claw marks dragging back toward the foundations of the camp. Animals took them, some insisted, but no prints, wolf, bear, fox ever appeared in that crystalline sea. One rescuer later claimed in private that on their last night before marching the survivors to safety, he opened his eyes wide to the moonlit meadow. There among the pines where the snow graves once yawned, he saw them. Dozens of gaunt shadows kneeling, their faces hollow, their ribs rattling with breath that should not exist. Watching, just watching. The Donner tragedy would be remembered by history as starvation, desperation, cannibalism. But those who felt the snow whisper against their cheeks that winter carried another memory. That not every grave stayed full, that not every scream was human, and that something in those mountains still waits beneath the snow.